It started with a mystery. At first, no one at the Green Meadow Rescue Center could figure out how the old horse kept escaping. Every morning, someone would find his stall wide open. No broken locks, no fence damage, just gone. And every time, hours later, he would return, dusty, tired, but calm, like he'd finished some private mission and was ready to rest. He wasn't young. He had a faded brown coat, white patches on his muzzle, and a strange, tired look in his eyes. His name was Buck, short for Buckshot. They'd been told when he arrived, and he had been left tied to a post outside the shelter one rainy night in August. No note, no explanation, just a name tag on his halter and a silent past nobody understood. The staff adored him, quiet, gentle, patient with children who came to visit. But this thing he did, disappearing into the hills behind the shelter, it was starting to worry everyone. Horses didn't just come and go like that, especially not alone. So one morning, as the sun peeked over the rolling pastures of Westbrook, a sleepy town tucked deep in the Tennessee countryside, a volunteer named Emma made a decision. She would follow him, not to stop him, just to know why. And what she discovered that day would shake the town to its core. Because sometimes, animals remember things we've long forgotten. And sometimes they come back, not for themselves, but for the ones we left behind. The morning air was thick with dew, and the sun hadn't yet burned the fog off the low hills. Emma stood by the wooden fence, arms folded, watching the old horse shift in his stall. Buck was restless again. He paced like he always did before his mysterious escapes. Slow, measured steps, nose to the ground, ears twitching at something far away. Emma tightened the straps of her backpack. Inside were a flashlight, a water bottle, and a small notebook. Nothing fancy, just enough to keep up. Today, she wouldn't stop him. She'd follow, quietly, carefully, and maybe finally get answers. At exactly 6:03 a.m., Buck nudged the stall gate with his nose. Creaked open without resistance. Emma blinked. She had checked the latch herself the night before, twice. She slipped behind him, her boots silent in the damp grass. Buck moved with purpose, weaving through the pasture like he'd done it 100 times. He didn't run. He didn't hesitate. He just walked, past the apple trees, past the creek, straight into the woods. Emma followed. The trees grew denser. Branches reached like crooked fingers overhead, and the path turned uneven and narrow. But Buck didn't slow down. He climbed and climbed until the air grew cooler and the wind carried scents Emma couldn't place. Earth, old wood, something metallic? After nearly an hour, they reached a clearing. Buck stopped. Emma froze, half hidden behind a tree, her breath caught in her throat. In the center of the clearing stood a collapsed barn, or what was left of one. Rotten beams, rusted nails, the bones of a place once full of life. Buck stepped forward and nudged the ground gently with his hoof. Then, he lowered his head and stood perfectly still. Not grazing, not exploring, just standing. Emma didn't understand, not yet. But her heart was already aching. Because the way Buck looked at that broken barn, it was like he remembered. Emma slowly stepped into the clearing, her boots crunching lightly over dried leaves and scattered debris. Buck didn't move. He stood like a statue, his gaze fixed on the ground in front of him. It wasn't just stillness, it was reverence. Emma looked around. The barn, or what remained of it, was clearly old. Nature had started reclaiming it. Vines curled through broken windows. A tree had grown up through what once might have been a feeding trough. Pieces of an old wooden sign lay splintered in the dirt, the faded letters barely readable. Red Fern Stables. She crouched near the broken sign, brushing away moss. The name didn't ring a bell. Not in Westbrook, anyway. She'd lived there her whole life, and there'd never been a place called that. Not in her time. Buck let out a low, almost mournful sound. A deep exhale, like a sigh that had waited years to be released. Then, to Emma's shock, he knelt. Front legs first, then his hind legs. He lay down in the clearing like he belonged there. Emma felt a chill crawl up her spine. What kind of horse finds his way back to a ruin in the middle of nowhere? And kneels. She stepped closer, kneeling beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You've been here before, haven't you?" she whispered. Buck didn't respond, of course, but his eyes, those old soulful eyes, stayed fixed on the barn, like he was seeing something that wasn't there anymore. Suddenly, a sound cracked through the silence, the snapping of a branch. Emma stood quickly, scanning the tree-line. "Hello?" she called. No answer. She took a step back. Maybe it was just a deer, or a fox, but Buck's ears twitched. Not in fear, but recognition. And that's when she noticed something under the collapsed doorway, just barely visible beneath the rubble. A flash of metal. Emma's heart skipped. She walked closer, brushed away a plank of wood, and there it was. A rusted horseshoe, still nailed into a piece of floorboard. She turned to Buck, confused. "Is this yours?" He didn't move, but his eyes glistened. Emma didn't know what it all meant. Not yet, but deep inside she could feel it. This wasn't just a clearing. This was the beginning of a story long buried. The rusted horseshoe felt heavier than it should. Emma turned it over in her hands, brushing off layers of dirt and time. It wasn't just old, it was handmade, uneven, crude. She looked back at Buck. He was still lying there, breathing slow and steady, like he'd found peace in the ruins. Emma's fingers ran along the edge of the wood still attached to the shoe. That's when she noticed it, barely etched into the old plank, almost invisible beneath the rust. "BS, her brows knit. Couldn't be. Could it? Buckshot?" she said aloud, the name catching on her tongue. The same initials. Her heart picked up speed. Maybe it was coincidence. Or maybe not. Maybe Buck wasn't just wandering. Maybe he was remembering. She pulled out her phone and took pictures of everything, the horseshoe, the sign, the collapsed structure. Then she sat beside Buck in the grass, still damp with morning dew, and opened her notebook. She needed answers. Back at the shelter, old Miss Callahan, the founder, had mentioned once that some animals came with secrets. She used to say, "Sometimes they don't find us. We find them because they've already chosen us." Emma never really understood that. Not until now. She reached out and gently stroked Buck's mane. "I don't know who you were," she murmured, "but I think this place remembers you." Buck let out a soft snort, closing his eyes. Emma stayed for a while, soaking in the stillness. Birds chirped in the trees overhead. Wind moved lazily through the grass. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker tapped rhythmically against bark. Eventually, Buck stood up. He walked slowly to the side of the barn, sniffing along the collapsed wall. Then he stopped again, this time near what looked like an old fence post, splintered and half swallowed by vines. There, nailed into the post, was something else. A tag, round, metal, faded. Emma pulled it free and held it up to the light. It read, "Property of Red Fern Stables, owner Harold Jennings." Harold Jennings? The name meant nothing to her, but she had a feeling it was about to, because Buck was pacing again, slowly, toward the tree-line, and Emma knew the journey wasn't over. Wherever this was leading, she was going with him. Back at the rescue center that afternoon, Emma couldn't stop thinking about the name on the tag. Harold Jennings. She sat at the office computer, the horseshoe and ID tag wrapped carefully in her backpack beside her. The screen glowed as she typed the name into the local archive search. Nothing. Then she narrowed the location. Westbrook, Tennessee. Bingo. One article popped up, yellowed and grainy, scanned from an old county newspaper dated 1987. The headline read, "Local stable owner missing after fire at Red Fern." Emma leaned in, her eyes scanning quickly. Harold Jennings, owner of Red Fern Stables, has been missing since last Thursday following a fire that destroyed the main barn. Authorities say the fire appears accidental, but no remains were found. Locals say Harold was a quiet man who lived alone after his wife passed. He was known for training rescue horses and often took in abandoned animals off the highway. The article went on, but Emma's head was spinning. the barn. The name, the place, it was all real. She clicked on the only photo attached to the article, an old black and white picture of Harold Jennings. The man stood in front of the barn, smiling proudly next to a horse. Emma's breath caught. The horse. It was younger, sure, sleek coat, bright eyes. But the markings on its muzzle, the way it held its head. "Buck," she whispered. She pulled up the photo on her phone and compared it to one she'd taken of Buck that morning. It was him. Somehow, impossibly, the same horse from nearly 40 years ago. Emma felt dizzy. No horse lived that long. Not naturally. But here he was. Alive. Walking. Remembering. She sat back, heart pounding. What if Buck had survived that fire? What if he'd escaped, wandered, been picked up and passed around for years before ending up at their shelter? And what if he came back to find something or someone? Emma suddenly felt the weight of the moment settle on her chest. This wasn't just a mystery anymore. This was a promise, a bond that hadn't broken with time. And if Buck had carried it all these years, she wasn't about to let it go unfinished. That evening, as the Tennessee sky shifted to shades of orange and lavender, Emma returned to the clearing. This time, she wasn't just following Buck. She brought a flashlight, gloves, a small spade, and the photo of Harold Jennings folded neatly in her pocket. Buck followed her steps like a shadow, calm and close. There was a strange energy between them now, like he knew she was helping. When they reached the barn ruins, Emma knelt beside the collapsed foundation. Something in her gut told her there was more here. Not just memories, something physical, something buried. She began to dig near the rotted base of the barn, where the wood had long given way to moss and soil. Inch by inch, the ground gave way. Rocks, rusted nails, broken glass, then cloth. Emma paused, heart skipping. She brushed the dirt away with her gloved hands, revealing the corner of a burnt flannel shirt, darkened and brittle with age. Beneath it, bones. Small, human. Her breath caught. No way. Buck stood nearby, unmoving, watching. Emma called the local sheriff's office immediately. Within an hour, sirens pierced the quiet hills. Flashing lights painted the clearing red and blue. Deputies secured the area. Crime scene tape fluttered in the breeze. A forensic team confirmed what Emma already suspected. The remains were adult male, likely from the late 1980s. Burned, never recovered. They would need DNA to be sure, but Emma already knew. It was Harold. He hadn't gone missing after the fire. He died in it, and no one had ever found him. No one, except Buck. Somehow, the old horse had returned here over and over again. Not out of habit, but out of loyalty. Out of grief. The shelter staff was stunned. Reporters showed up the next day. It made the local news. Horse leads volunteer to 40-year-old mystery in Westbrook. Emma didn't care about the attention. All she cared about was the way Buck stood by the edge of the dig site, head bowed, eyes distant. He wasn't a horse anymore. He was a witness, a guardian, a friend who never stopped waiting. Over the next few days, Westbrook changed. People who hadn't driven down the old dirt roads in years now made their way toward the clearing behind Green Meadow Rescue. They brought flowers, notes. Some just stood quietly, hats in hand, near the place where Harold Jennings had finally been found. The sheriff confirmed the remains through dental records. Harold had no surviving family, but he wasn't forgotten. The townsfolk remembered him, the man who never said much, who kept to himself after his wife died, but who always had time for a frightened animal. Emma watched all of this unfold from the shelter office window, Buck grazing peacefully outside. She told the story a dozen times by now, each time more surreal than the last. When the reporter from Channel 12 asked her what made her follow the horse, she simply said, "He wasn't trying to escape. He was trying to go home." They held a small service for Harold near the clearing. A simple cross was planted in the earth with a plaque that read, "Harold Jennings, beloved horseman, finally at rest." Buck stood quietly beside the crowd the entire time, head lowered, still as a statue. He didn't make a sound, not a twitch, not a step, But when the final prayer ended and everyone turned to leave, Buck did something no one expected. He walked up to the cross, gently nudged the wooden post with his nose, then let out the softest, longest exhale, like he had been holding something in for 40 years. A woman in the crowd began to cry. An old man took off his cap and whispered, "Never seen anything like it in all my years." Emma stayed behind after everyone left. She sat on a flat rock beneath the same tree where Buck had once lain, looking out at the overgrown barn. "How did you survive, boy?" she asked quietly. "How did you remember all of this?" Buck didn't answer, of course, but she didn't need him to. Some things don't need words. Some stories are written in loyalty, in loss, in love. And Buck had written his across decades, in hoof prints, in silent visits, in the unshakable bond he refused to break. In the days following Harold's memorial, Buck changed. Not outwardly. He still walked slowly, ate his oats with quiet patience, and watched the pasture with that steady gaze of his. But something in his posture was lighter, freer. The tension that once lived in his shoulders had lifted, as if the weight of memory had finally settled into peace. Emma noticed it first. He no longer paced at sunrise. He no longer pressed against the stall door or looked toward the hills with longing. For the first time since he arrived at Green Meadow, Buck seemed present. And with him, the shelter changed too. Word had spread. Families came from neighboring towns, drawn not just by the story, but by the need to believe that animals could love as fiercely and remember as deeply as any human ever could. They didn't come to adopt Buck. Everyone knew he wasn't going anywhere. They came to meet him, to brush his coat, to kneel beside him and whisper secrets they couldn't tell anyone else. Children brought him apples wrapped in paper towels. Elderly couples stood quietly, hands clasped, just to be near him. They called him the witness horse. Others called him Harold's boy. Emma simply called him friend. One afternoon, she sat beside him under the same tree near the field, watching the clouds roll by. "I think you knew," she said softly, scratching behind his ear. "You knew he never made it out. You knew where to find him, even after all these years." Buck blinked slowly, then nudged her shoulder, almost playfully. She smiled. The shelter began using his story to teach kids about loyalty and trust. They hung the photograph of young Buck and Harold in the visitor center, with a brass plaque below that read, "Some bonds never fade. Some hearts never forget." And when school groups visited, Emma would gather them in the shade and tell the story not as a ghost tale, but as a reminder that animals feel, that they love, that they remember, sometimes better than we do. And every time, Buck would stand quietly nearby, listening, just as he always had. One rainy morning, about a month after Harold's memorial, Emma received a letter. It was from the Tennessee Heritage Society, a quiet organization dedicated to preserving stories that might otherwise disappear. Somehow, word of Buck's journey and Harold's discovery had reached them. The letter was hand-signed and simple. "We would like to formally recognize Buck as an honorary service animal and include his story in our permanent archive. We also wish to offer him a place of retirement at our sanctuary in Knoxville. Acres of open pasture, full veterinary care, and companionship in his final years." Emma read it 3 times. On paper, it was the perfect offer, a reward for Buck's loyalty, peace, comfort, rest. But something about it made her uneasy. That afternoon, she sat beside Buck under their tree, the rain now a light mist over the hills. She read the letter aloud to him, every word. He stood quietly beside her, eyes half closed, tail flicking slowly. When she finished, she folded the letter and slipped it into her jacket pocket. Then, without thinking, she asked aloud, "Do you want to go, Buck?" She laughed softly at herself. "I guess I already know the answer, because Buck, for all his wandering, for all the years he spent looking for the past, wasn't wandering anymore. He had found what he was looking for, and now he stayed." That night, Emma wrote back, "Thank you for your generous offer, but Buck has already found his sanctuary. It's not a place, it's a promise. And he's keeping it here where it began. The next day, the shelter board made it official. Buck would remain at Green Meadow Rescue for the rest of his days. No more adoption lists. No more transfers. He wasn't up for placement. He was home. They built him a new open-air stall, wide, comfortable, and shaded by the oak trees near the clearing. The walls were painted white, and above the gate, a sign in carved wood read, "Buck's Post, Loyalty Lives Here." Visitors still came, but now they came to sit in silence, to listen, to remember. And sometimes, just sometimes, they swore they could hear hooves in the woods behind the barn, long after Buck had settled in for the night. Late one afternoon, as golden sunlight filtered through the trees, Emma found Buck standing at the edge of the pasture, staring toward the distant hills. She walked over slowly, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound. Buck didn't flinch. He turned his head just enough to meet her eyes, deep, warm, full of stories only he could tell. Emma sat beside him on the cool grass, pulling her jacket tighter against the breeze. They sat in silence for a long time. No words were needed. The bond between them had grown into something unspoken but undeniable, built on trust, patience, and years of shared quiet moments. Emma remembered the first day she followed Buck into those woods, the mystery of the broken barn, the discovery of Harold's story. She smiled, knowing their journey had changed both their lives forever. Behind her, the shelter buzzed softly with visitors and volunteers. But here, in this moment, it was just the two of them. Buck shifted slightly, resting his muzzle against Emma's shoulder. Her heart swelled. This was more than rescue. This was family. And as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the pasture, Emma knew their story wasn't just about loss or mystery. It was about love, loyalty, and the quiet strength that carries us through the hardest journeys. Seasons changed. The rolling hills of Westbrook witnessed many sunrises and sunsets, but Buck remained a steady presence, a living legend in a small town that had finally learned to listen. Emma often thought about how a stray horse, abandoned and lost, had brought a forgotten story back to life, how his silent footsteps led her to uncover a man's final resting place, how loyalty had stretched beyond time and pain. The shelter became more than a refuge. It was a testament to hope, to second chances, to the bonds that can never be broken. Buck grew older, his coat graying and his movements slowing, but his spirit never wavered. Visitors came from far and wide, drawn by the story and the quiet dignity of a horse who refused to forget. One crisp autumn afternoon, Emma sat beside him beneath their favorite oak tree. The leaves rustled softly as a gentle breeze carried the scent of earth and rain. Buck rested his head on her lap, eyes half closed, content. "You found your home, boy," Emma whispered, stroking his mane. He let out a soft, long breath, the kind that speaks of peace and belonging. And as the sun dipped below the hills, casting a golden glow over the pasture, Emma smiled through tears. Because some stories don't need words to be told. They live in the heartbeats we carry, in the memories we honor, and in the love that never fades. Buck's story would live on forever, not just as a tale of a horse, but as a reminder that even in the darkest places, there is light. And sometimes that light comes on four legs and a loyal heart.